adventures of Ellen White and the Pioneers. The Forgotten Vision and the Forgotten Letter.
In 1890, about a year before Mrs. White went to Australia, she had a vision in a place called Salamanca, New York. The next morning she spoke to her son William, saying, "I want to tell you about a vision I had last night. In the vision, I seemed to be in Battle Creek, and I was taken to the Review and Herald building, and the angel messenger bade me, 'Follow me.'" And then she stopped speaking. The vision was gone from her, and she could not remember any more about it. She started over again and tried to relate it, but again it vanished from her mind. And then with her son and her secretary, Miss McEntipher, she went on to the other meetings in Virginia, and as she had time she wrote in her diary what she had tried to tell that day in the vision. Early the next spring she was back in Battle Creek attending the General Conference, and one Sabbath afternoon she spoke to a large audience, and she began to try to tell the vision, and again she could not remember it just as before. Twice again during the sermon she attempted to tell the vision, and each time she could not remember it. And finally she said, "Of this I shall have to say more later." After the meeting, Elder Olson, the General Conference President, asked her if she would like to take the morning meeting again. "No," she said, "I am too tired and I have already borne my testimony. You must make other plans for the morning meeting. I will not be able to come." The same night a group of men met in an office room in the Review and Herald, and they met to talk about Religious Liberty magazine, now called Liberty. But then they called it the American Sentinel. The Religious Liberty people wanted the legislators and judges to read the Sentinel, but the magazine told of the suffering and persecution that would befall the nation if its people were forbidden to worship God as they believed they should. And these men felt that if the judges and legislators read about this, they'd not like it, and so they wanted to take these things out of the paper. The meeting lasted until 2 o'clock in the morning, and then all the men went home. And about 3 o'clock the Lord sent his angel to wake up Mrs. White, to tell her that she must go early morning to a meeting and tell the workers what she'd seen at Salamanca. So she got dressed and went to her dresser drawer and took her diary and began to read. And as she scanned the pages, the scene of the vision came freshly to her mind, and she wrote more to go with the words that she'd already written. And when Elder Olson, the General Conference President, saw her in the morning meeting, he said, "Sister White, we are happy to see you. Do you have a message for us?" "Indeed I do," she said, and she stepped to the front. And she began speaking. "In the vision, I seemed to be in Battle Creek. I was taken to the Review and Herald office, and an angel messenger bade me, 'Follow me.' That was where she'd always stopped before, and could not remember any further. And so her son leaned eagerly forward to see if she would continue. 5 times he had heard her try to tell this vision, and each time she had forgotten it. Then she said, the angel had led her to a room where a group of men were discussing certain articles that were being printed in the American Sentinel. She said, "I saw one of the men take a copy of the Sentinel, hold it high over his head and say, 'Unless these articles on the Sabbath and the Second Advent come out of this paper, we can no longer use it as an organ of the Religious Liberty Association.'" She continued speaking for an hour, telling about the meeting that she had seen in the vision. Then she gave the members the instruction that the angel had given to her for them, that they were to continue to print the truths about the Sabbath and Jesus' coming, just as they had been doing. Then she sat down. Then a man in the back of the room stood up. "I was at that meeting last night," he said. "Last night?" Mrs. White exclaimed. "Last night? I thought that meeting took place months ago when it was shown to me in a vision." "I was in that meeting last night," the man repeated, "and I am the man who made the remark about the articles in the paper, holding it high over my head. I'm sorry to say that I was on the wrong side, but I take this opportunity to place myself now on the right side." And he sat down. And soon other members who had been present at the night meeting stood up, and they gave a similar testimony. And now you can see why Mrs. White was not permitted to tell the vision earlier, because if she had told it, the event would not have taken place. And also it shows how Mrs. White was just as dependent on the Holy Spirit in remembering and recalling the visions to tell it to others and to write it out, as she was dependent upon receiving it. And now about the forgotten letter. You remember the story about the very icy baptism when Elder and Mrs. White visited the church members in Washington, New Hampshire, whereupon 18 boys and girls were baptized? Well, among the members of that church was a man named Stephen Smith. And though it was a happy ending, the story of his life is a sad one. It was in the year 1850, 6 years after the first group of members began keeping the Sabbath in Washington, New Hampshire, that Stephen Smith joined the Sabbath-keeping Adventists. At that time he was an earnest temperance worker, and also he did not believe in slavery. And because of his activity in his support of these two reforms, he suffered a lot of insult and persecution. And now he had accepted another unpopular truth: Sabbath-keeping. He was a very active man in missionary work and spent all of his time going from place to place teaching the people the importance of keeping all the commandments and being ready for Jesus' coming. But there was one part of the Advent message that Stephen Smith did not accept. Revelation 19:10 tells us that God's last church would not only keep all the commandments, but they would also have the testimony of Jesus, which is the spirit of prophecy. But Stephen Smith did not believe Ellen White's visions were from heaven. He said that Mrs. White made up the stories that she told as visions. Satan did not like the good work that was going on at the Washington, New Hampshire church, and so he began to start trouble there. And soon there were people teaching that Jesus was not really going to come himself to earth, that he had already come by his Spirit, and that this was the only second coming of Christ that would ever be seen. Stephen Smith had been a spiritualist, and he still cherished some of his spiritualistic teachings about the coming of Christ. It was only about a year after Smith joined the Washington, New Hampshire church that a conference was held in his church, which was attended by Elder and Mrs. White. And while here, Mrs. White was given a special vision in which she was shown some of the wrong things that Stephen Smith and others were teaching. There were about 75 people present at the conference, and they all believed that God had spoken in the vision to Mrs. White, except Stephen Smith and one other man. All the others confessed that they had been wrong and accepted the reproof that was given. But God loved Stephen Smith, and later sent a special message to him in the form of a testimony from Mrs. White. So one day, when he called at the post office, he was handed a long envelope. Before he opened it, he saw a return address on the envelope: Ellen G. White, Battle Creek, Michigan. "Mrs. White has written me a testimony which I do not want," he said to himself, and he felt angry. And for a moment he stood there holding the letter in his hand, wondering what he should do. And finally he decided that he would not read it. And he pushed the unopened envelope into his coat pocket and went home. And when he reached the house, he went to his room and hid the letter in the bottom of a trunk or an old storage box. Stephen Smith would come to church on some Sabbaths, and he always professed to keep the Sabbath. But when he did go to church, It was really only to argue and debate with the church members and to say unkind things about them, and especially about Mrs. White. And soon he joined another group of people that were always finding fault with the ministers. And so time went by, 5, 10, 20, 25, 27 years. And all this time that letter lay at the bottom of that trunk or that box, unopened and forgotten. And all this time Stephen Smith's family kept praying for him because they loved him and they could see that he was not happy. Then one day Stephen Smith picked up a copy of the Review and Herald and he began to read it. And it was an article signed by Mrs. White. He decided to read it, and when he finished he said to himself, "That's the truth." Next week there was another article written by Mrs. White in the Review, and again he read it. And each week after that he began reading her articles, and they began to change his life. At that time Elder Eugene Farnsworth, who Stephen Smith had come to know as a boy, came to town to preach, and so Smith went to hear him speak. Elder Farnsworth talked about the rise of the Advent movement and its spread over much of the world, and how its spread was fulfilling the prophecies in the book of Revelation. And at the close of the meeting, Stephen Smith stood up and began to speak. Now he was an old man with white hair and bent shoulders. He told the church members how sorry he was for the unkind things that he had said about them, and for the many years he had been separated from them. And he said that he wanted to come back into the church and enjoy fellowship of the church members again. Then Elder Farnsworth announced that he was going to speak again the following week. So Stephen Smith decided that he would be sure to be present for the following Sabbath meeting. During the week he had much time to reflect over the past, and on the Wednesday before Sabbath he remembered that letter that he had hidden in the old trunk. It was 28 years ago now, and for the first time he really wanted to know what it said. So he looked in his trunk, and there he found at the bottom the letter, and he opened it and he began to read. And what did he find there? He read a warning of the bitterness and the disappointment that would come to him if he did not change his ways. And it was a very true picture of the last 28 years of his life that had passed. And it contained an appeal for him to repent, and a promise that if he would do so, he would be forgiven, and that God so loved him. When Elder Farnsworth finished speaking on Sabbath morning, Stephen Smith rose to his feet again and he said, "I received a testimony from Mrs. White 28 years ago. I took it home and I locked it in my trunk, and I have never read it until last Wednesday. Brethren, every word of that testimony for me is true, and I accept it, and I have come to the place where I finally believe that the testimonies of Sister White are all of God. And if I had followed the one God sent to me, as well as the rest, it would have changed the whole course of my life, and I would have been a very different man. To my sorrow, I found that the visions were right, and I was wrong." We're glad that Stephen Smith finally repented and confessed the wrong that he'd done to himself and to his friends, and from that time on he lived a good Christian life until he died. But how sad, how foolish that he had not opened that letter 28 years before to find out what God was saying to him. How much trouble and sorrow he might have saved himself and others if he had read it and heeded or followed the warning. Could it be that we're making the same mistake today as Stephen Smith did? God has sent in these last days many messages in the testimonies and in the Conflict of the Ages books. They have been written down for our instruction. But are we any wiser than old Stephen Smith if we leave these books unopened on the shelves? If we read and study the Bible and read and study these books, they will help us recognize our mistakes and help prepare our hearts for the coming of Jesus and the glory of heaven. Come and join us next time to hear about traveling the narrow way.